In this video, I'm going to talk about the theory underpinning the limited interests in the context of capital acquisitions tax. So we're looking at a situation where a person doesn't receive absolute ownership of an asset either by gift or inheritance, but instead has a restricted interest in that asset. So let's have a look at some of the details and the definitions to start. So up to now, we've looked at the concept of absolute interests, where you essentially take ownership of the asset or part of the asset. So it's yours to buy and sell. You can essentially do what you want with it. In a limited interest, you don't take ownership. So you may take life interest, okay, where you get the use of an asset for the duration of your life. Now, it doesn't have to be your life. It could, in fact, be based on the life of somebody else, as is noted down here. Okay, so it's worth noting that it doesn't have to be just your life. So the interest could end when another person's life ends. Okay, alternatively, you could get interest for a period certain, in other words, a defined number of years. So I may give an asset to say a niece or nephew between the ages of 20 and 25, so 5 years duration. That would be a period certain. Okay, so you get it for a fixed amount of time. Now, in each of these types of interest, life interest and period certain interest, because you're not receiving the asset outright, you're not going to be taxed on the full value of the asset. So the taxable value and the amount of tax is less than if an absolute interest were taken. So we need to have some method of computing the taxable value of an interest for a life duration or for a period certain. So there's a number of tables which are provided which help us do that, and the tables set out the rules and the factors to use for different types of scenarios. So the general point is that the value will depend on a number of things. So for a life interest, you're looking at the age and gender of the person for whose life the benefit is given. Now I want to emphasize that bit in the inverted commas. So this sets up the possibility that I may give a life interest to, say, a brother or a sister, so long as the eldest brother is alive, or so long as my aunt is alive, or so long as somebody else is alive. It doesn't have to be the person to whom I give the gift. Okay, so depending on the age of what you might call the relevant person, the person whose life we are measuring, and the gender of that person, there are various calculation factors available to determine the interest of the value of that interest. The other type of interest is interest for a period certain. So it's going to depend on how long that period is. So obviously, if I give an interest for a period of 5 years, that's worth much less than giving an interest for a period of 10 years. So again, you could appreciate that there is going to be a difference in the relevant values of such interests. Now, the tables that we use are provided by the Revenue Commissioners, and they're standard items provided in exams, and they're set out at the end of this document. So if you, in your own document, would turn to the relevant page, I'm just going to go to the tables myself. So it's in the appendix, Table A and Table B. Now, just to make sure you understand the general idea of this, so for the moment you can disregard the joint factor. So this column here, we're not going to be seeing this, so it's possible to just disregard that. So if I provide to my 20-year-old, say, niece or nephew, a life interest, okay, so that person is currently aged 20, and he or she is going to have the use of this asset for the rest of his or her days. Okay, so we're basing it on the life of the recipient. Then you multiply the market value of the property by the appropriate factor. So you can see that for a male, the factor is going to be 0.9444, and for a female it's going to be a little bit higher. And of course the reason for the difference is that on average women live a little bit longer than men, so if they have an asset for life, they're likely to have it for a little bit longer, so that is reflected in the factor used. So say the asset was worth €100,000. Okay, I'm giving a property with a value of €100,000 to my 20-year-old, we'll say nephew. I'd multiply 100,000 by 0.944, and if it were to my 20-year-old niece, I'd multiply 100,000 by 0.9572, and that would give the assessable value before deducting any small gift exemption. Okay, now for other interest periods, certain interests, there's a separate table. So this is where you give an interest for say 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, and you can see that there are factors provided for varying lengths of time. So the factor for a 10-year interest would be 0.4913. Okay, so say again I give a property worth 100,000 for 10 years to a person. Okay, so it's a period certain rather than a life interest. I'd multiply 100,000 by 0.4913, and that would be the assessable value before any small gift exemption. Now, to go back to the main text. Okay, now you can see that I've struck out certain text concerning contingencies, so you can disregard that for the purpose of your studies. One of the significant interests to be aware of is the rights of residence, maintenance and support. This is quite common in practice, and it is worth being aware of the implications of such a right. So the recipient gets the right to live in a property. So the typical scenario would be perhaps an aged relative is going to be permitted to stay in a house which may well be provided to another person. Okay, so for instance, the relative who currently owns the house may decide to make a gift of it to his or her son or daughter, subject to being permitted to live in it for the rest of his or her days. Okay, so say the son receives the house but has to permit the mother to live in the house for the rest of her life. Okay, so that's the deal that is struck between them. Okay, so the nature of the right can fall under one of two categories. Okay, so you can have residence only, okay, so essentially rent free, or you could have residence, maintenance and support, which is a much more inclusive and valuable right. And each of them has a slightly different approach to calculating their value. As you can probably appreciate, the value of residence only would be much, much lower than the rights to residence, maintenance and support. So the point is that we need to determine the value of this right. Okay, so there's a formula, as you can probably guess, and the formula is as indicated here. So the annual value of the right divided by the annual value of the property multiplied by the market value of the property upon which the right is charged. Okay, so it's a bit of a I suppose a mouthful in a sense. Annual value is essentially the rent that you are receiving or could receive. So the annual value of the right, say you're allowing your aged relative to use the house and he or she has, say, her own bedroom and the use of facilities. That might equate to 1/4 or 1/5 or 1/3 of the entire property. So the factor would work out as perhaps 1 out of 3. So annual value of the right would maybe reflect the rent which the individual would have to pay for that particular benefit. Okay, so the right to use one bedroom plus the facilities generally. Annual value of the entire property would be, if you could rent out the entire property at a fair rent, what would you get? So this is going to be a fraction, and these values would always be given in questions. So this might say be €2,000 over €6,000. Okay, so the right is estimated at an annual value of €2,000, out of 6,000 for the entire property. And then you multiply that fraction by the market value of the property upon which the right is charged. So let's try put into kind of maybe something a little bit more understandable with an example. So on the death of John Ryan, his nephew Tom inherited John's house, okay, but John provided in his will that his sister Mary, so Mary, who's aged 60, was entitled to a right of residence in the house for her life. Okay, so it's based on her life, and she's female, age 60. So relevant details: the market value of the house, that's the entire market price of the house, 200,000. The right of residence is valued at 2,000. Okay, so the annual value of Mary's right is 2,000, and if the house could be rented out, you could expect to get 20,000. Okay, so compute the value of the right taken by Mary. Okay, now some of the relevant factors here. We're talking about Mary, a female, age 60, and obviously these highlighted values here are going to be used in my main formula. So looking at the solution to this, so market value of the benefit taken by Mary is 2,000 over 20,000. So her particular benefit over the entire value of the rent available for the house by 200,000, the capital value. So it works out as 20,000. Now, you then have to factor in the fact that this is being taken by Mary just for her life. Okay, so we're looking at a life interest for a female aged 60. Okay, so 20,000, which is the number we got up here, multiplied by 0.6475, and again, just to show the 0.6475, so we're looking at life interests for a female aged 60. Okay, 0.6475. Okay, so there's the factor that we take for the female aged 60. Okay, so we got her interest is, or her benefit is worth 12,950, and this value is what you would put in the aggregation process for Mary. Okay, so depending on the relationship, it could be a group C relationship perhaps, and that would go through the aggregation process for Mary. Now, a significant point to be aware of is that we've also got Tom in this question inheriting the house. The house is worth 200,000, but Tom is obliged to allow Mary to stay in the house. So the value of what Mary is being charged on, ignoring the life element, is essentially a deduction for Tom. Okay, so this is an important point to note. So when the assessable value for Tom, okay, we're looking now at the person who's getting the house effectively in total, is being calculated, the benefit taken by Mary is deducted as a liability. So it's the value of the right before applying the life factor. Okay, so 20,000, which is deducted. So the house is 200,000 for Tom, but we take off this liabilities, costs and expenses, being the value of the interest that Mary is getting before applying the life factor. So on 180,000, and there's nothing being paid by Tom, so assessable value for Tom would be 180, and that also goes through the aggregation procedure. Okay, so again, that's just the general idea of life interest and limited interest residence only, or residence maintenance and support. Now, I've got some points here which I've just disregarded, so again, for the purpose of your study, you can disregard these also. So there's just two rules that I want you to be conscious of. Life interest is rule 1. Okay, so interest for a single life, okay, in a capital sum. So that's life interest. And I'll just highlight the single life words there. So it depends on the age and gender of the person. Okay, appropriate to the age and gender of the person in respect of whom the life interest has been valued. Okay, so that's probably an important latter point. So the person receiving the asset, it may be the age and gender of that person, but it could be the age and gender of an entirely different person. And these two examples just illustrate the point. So Siobhan, aged 50, inherits a life interest in a house valued at 200,000. The administration costs are 10,000, so 200 minus 10 is 190. Now, because it's Siobhan who's receiving this, okay, she is a female, it's based on herself. She's a female aged 50, and if you look at the tables at the back, okay, for life interests, female aged 50, 0.7791. Okay, so going back to that, 0.7791. So for the purpose of Siobhan, this is what goes into the aggregation procedure for her. Now, to look at another example, I just want to look at the example with Harold. Harold leaves land worth 500,000 to Ken for the life of Gemma. Okay, so that's the kind of the life that we're going to be using. The life and the age and gender of Gemma is the issue here. So she's a woman aged 50. So the appropriate age factor again is 0.7791. Okay, it's not the factor that would apply to Ken, because the person whose life is determining the value is Gemma. Okay, so the value then would be 500,000 by 0.7791. That's the value that would go into the aggregation process for Ken. Okay. The other rule, I ignore rules 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the interest in a capital sum for a period certain. Okay, so just want to highlight that. So it's straightforward if the period certain is an exact number of years. Say it's exactly for 5 years or exactly for 6 years. You can see that you have very simple factors to use in the table B. So for 5 years, the factor is 0.2869. For 10 years, it's 0.4913. But what if it's for some fraction of a year, like 5.5 years or 5 years and 1 month or something like that? That's what the example wants to look at. So just looking at this particular scenario, so this is rule 6. Okay, so just to look at the example. So Margaret, aged 25 exactly, is given a house valued at 100,000 until she's 30 years old. So for exactly 5 years. Okay, so that's going to be the easy scenario. We can just use 100,000 by 0.2869. So that's the value that will go into the aggregation procedure for Margaret. Now, Janice, aged 25 years and 265 days, receives a gift of a house valued at 100,000 until her 30th birthday. So it's not exactly 5 years. This is that little bit more complex. It's for 4 years and 100 days. So what you have to do is you have to calculate for the 5th year, so 5 years, okay, using the normal factor, and then look at the value for 4 years. Okay, so again, using the 4-year factor, the difference is 4,990, and we have to take a fraction, 100 out of 365, of that difference. So 4990, which we got up here, we need 100 out of 365. So this is basically between year 4 and 5. So we need 100 days. So that's 1367. So 4 years plus another 100 days. Okay, 23,700 plus 1367 gives us the value for 4 years and 100 days. Okay, so those scenarios where it's not an exact number of years, there's a little bit of a calculation involved. Okay, you go 1 year more than the total being granted. So that was 4 years and 100 days. So you go to 5 years and you get a number. Go to 4 years exactly, get a number, the difference, and take whatever fraction of that year, so 100 days out of 365, and add that to the 4-year value, 23,700. So that completes the quick overview of limited interests. And in later videos, I'll look at a couple of simple examples, but you can take it that anything that I haven't covered in this video in respect of limited interests is definitely not examinable.